Hi, I'm Jennifer Chow, EDF Senior Director for Climate Resilient Food Systems. I'm here with Dr. Cary Fowler, U.S. Special Envoy for Global Food Security. And we just came out today, it's New York Climate Week. We just came out of an adaptation panel focused on food and agriculture and what we need to do to adapt to a changing world and a changing climate. Dr. Fowler just shared with us a really intriguing thought around how the world has really invested heavily in the top 4 to 5 major crops, and there are, how many others? So many others, hundreds of others that we are underinvesting or not at all investing in. Some where there's no breeders, and it's really hard to see a future for them. So my question to you, Dr. Fowler, is how do we change that? If the commercial opportunity is really in those top 4 to 5, how do we ever see hope in the rest of those crops getting any attention or funding in a way that will secure diversity and help with our climate issue?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is we have to realize that we're making an assumption about all those other crops, and that assumption is that somehow magically they're going to adapt to the climates that we're seeing and the climates that are coming. And we have no factual basis to make that assumption on. So these are crops that, because we haven't invested in them very much in the past, are going to be vulnerable to the kinds of changes that are unfolding now with climate. I think we can perhaps learn something from our history, and at this point in time, I think first of all, we need to assess what are the most important crops for nutrition on a regional or sub-regional basis. We need to ask ourselves and bring in the experts to figure out how are those crops going to fare in a climate-changing world. And I think if we know those two things, it'll change the way we look at the world, and it might give us a better grounding for making more informed decisions about our investments, about our research dollars and such. But I also think there's something fascinating from history that we can learn, and it's our own history here in the United States. It has to do with our own crops that we grow. We grow hundreds of crops here. So the question is, well, how did our own crops become adapted to growing all these different environments in the United States? You know, potatoes come from the Andes, wheat comes from the Mideast, soybeans come from China. None of our crops here, our major crops, are really indigenous to the United States. And what happened was that in the 1800s, the Patent and Trademark Office, out of which the USDA grew, started to assemble large quantities of seed, of diversity from around the world, and they distributed it to farmers. They distributed it in small packages, sometimes at the rate of tens of millions of packages every year. And they asked those farmers to experiment, to grow this diversity, these varieties. And the farmers engaged in that experiment, and that largely very much explains how crops became adapted to the U.S. It also explains where some of our seed companies came from, because the farmers that were really successful in selecting varieties, and their neighbors noticed, and maybe they made a business out of it. But this is how you got this diversity spread around the world, from which spread around the United States, from which selection by farmers could take place. And it was a farmer-driven adaptation process, and that's how it happened in the United States.
It's a great story. Yeah. You think we can do something like that again?
I don't know. People will say, well, gosh, that's kind of a wild idea, but it happens here. And the central elements of that story are still in play, and they're essentially all about Darwinian adaptation. You need diversity, you need inheritance, you need natural selection, and you need time. If you have all of those things together, you get adaptation, and we do have all those things now.
Just have to get started.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fowler.
Sure.